what was the reaction like where you were, Annalise? I've got to say that listening to Donald Trump, it was just noticeable that he didn't have that huge audience that he gets at these rallies that maybe energises him. The past few minutes there, dare I say it, he almost sounded like he was running out of steam. What was the reaction where you were?
Oh, they were hanging on his every word here, Tom. This is a crowd of really devoted Trump supporters, but there were a few key points that you could tell they were getting more excited about. Those immigration points were the ones where we had a big applause here. Also, abortion, that's a very topical issue in the middle of America, as we've seen right through the past few elections. But what we really saw cut through here was just those Joe Biden attacks, as you said. They went hard on Donald Trump during the Democratic convention, so they really were returning serve for the Republican convention. And the point when they say that he's a socialist, that really talks to these kind of voters here. They were really responding to that. And one of the issues that really hasn't been getting a lot of coverage overseas, but is a really bread and butter issue here, is about pharmaceuticals. And Donald Trump's made a few different policy moves there, and including about this these changes that allow people who wouldn't be eligible for a drug trial to try it anyway. That's actually one of those things that people bring up on a day-to-day basis that you don't really hear a lot of. And so that's another thing that was mentioned and got quite a strong response. But overwhelmingly, it's all about law and order. It's about the riots. It's about the protests. And we heard that a few times in Donald Trump's speech. That got a strong response here too. People want to feel safe.
I'm not sure if anyone counted the flags. I'd say maybe 50, perhaps one for each state, just looking at how many there are there. Look, an interesting part of this is...
You can never have too many flags, so...
No, not when you've got all that space. But one of the interesting things about this is how you frame COVID-19. Around the rest of the world, nobody thinks the US has handled this well. Yes, of course, we understand as well the frustration with China, but putting that to one side, the US handling of this, he keeps calling out Joe Biden for saying, when I stopped travel coming in from China, planes coming in from China, Joe Biden criticised me. Now, this is interesting because if you look into this, Biden at the time, when they were talking about a restriction, said Trump had a record of hysteria and xenophobia. And then he used the phrase xenophobic when Donald Trump tweeted about the Chinese virus, but also stopping travellers. So it's not clear whether he was disagreeing with travellers or not. I guess the key thing is, for Donald Trump, Annalise, it's something that's at least nuanced, that if Joe Biden wants to refute that, it's not easy. And that seems to be everything he's going to base the COVID attacks on, if you like. Hey, it would have been worse under Joe Biden.
It's kind of a clever way to approach it, where he gets to have it both ways and said, I was the toughest on COVID and also I'm going to be the one to get us out of it. Because I can tell you, the further south I've travelled in the short time I've been in America, the less you see people taking COVID seriously. The mask wearing in the south has been almost non-existent if people aren't at work and required to do it. It was much stricter in Wisconsin, and the distancing as well. And so people here overwhelmingly more concerned about the economy, about getting people back to work. And the big issue next week is going to be getting kids back to school, because they're coming back from their summer vacation now. And teachers are furious. That leads into the union argument. Democrats don't want them going back to school under dangerous circumstances. And we've seen both sides wheel out different teachers on that point. So I would say the COVID response, to appeal to his base, is going to have to focus on the economy. I asked a few people here, even a couple of people who were wearing masks said they were only doing it because it's the law and they respect the law.
Yeah, still pointing to these fireworks. This is quite the display, I suppose, as you'd expect. Love to know how much they costed. It's beyond even what we probably have here in New Year's Eve. Annalise, the other side of this, though, because yes, there's appealing to the base, and they might go, yeah, we're hanging on every word here, you know, down from hydroxychloroquine and whether that might work as some sort of cure, which all the expert evidence at the moment suggests no. But, you know, this was the other problem with Donald Trump for months, saying things such as the virus will disappear, refusing to wear a mask or condone wearing a mask until July as well. So that's the tough part of you talking about trying to appeal for, you know, more the middle rung of voters on COVID-19 and your handling of that.
I'd be pretty surprised, even if they've developed a vaccine, if anyone at this event or around here would even get it. I think it's such a far-flung issue, and it's just to be the best, and that's all that he's really promising, and that's been a real winner for him. It was in Ivanka Trump's speech as well, where she said, I'm going to get the best deal for America in every instance, and so that's what really resonates with voters, especially in the United States, used to being a superpower. They want to be number one. And the other thing I thought was really interesting was she made a real point about how he did the deal for Wisconsin farmers. They had more Wisconsin business owners today. I think we've seen more Wisconsinites in the Republican convention than we saw in the Democratic one that was supposed to be in Wisconsin. So right now I think the Republican Party is actually doing a very good job at appealing to swing states. They've had their presence in North Carolina. Donald Trump's getting out. It's going to be whether those people who are staying home because of coronavirus get out and vote.
Annalise, stay with us. I'm going to bring in James Morrow, opinion editor at the Daily Telegraph and host of Outsiders on Sky News. James, you've been watching this, of course. What are your thoughts, first of all?
Yeah, well, look, I think it was a good speech. It was a strong speech. It went on, I think, a bit too long. But other than that, I think there's a lot of key differences that you need to point out between the Republican approach to this whole speech as well as the entire convention. You know, we saw last week the Democrats run a convention that was incredibly dark, incredibly negative, and also for a bunch of people who are supposedly owned by Hollywood, had really, really poor production values. And now we've just watched 4 days of this Republican convention where they embraced this new format of a convention, and Trump came and gave this speech at the end of it, which I do think went a bit too long, and it was a bit too State of the Union-like, but made some very good points. I'd take issue with a couple of things that we've been talking about here. You know, when it came to the American handling of the pandemic, that was on Andrew Cuomo. That was New York State's fault mostly. That's why the numbers were so bad. You take some of those Democratic states out of the mix, America did a much better job than I think Donald Trump in the United States is given credit for. But in terms of the speech, I thought it was really interesting because where Joe Biden went and said, America is trapped between light and dark, and he sort of, in a more literary way, said that half the country is a basket of deplorables, you know, the Trump supporters. Trump was really smart. He focused dead in on Joe Biden and said, he's the guy, he's the problem. That means that people who might be wavering, might be on the left, but thinking, I don't like what's going on in all these Democrat cities, which are being destroyed by rioters and looters, all in the name of quote-unquote protest. There's room for them to say, you know, I'm not going to vote Biden, I'm going to vote Trump. I think on that level, it was a far cannier speech than anything Biden did.
So on the COVID handling, though, I mean, surely there's a bit of an issue with, as I said, some of the things Donald Trump has said about the virus along the stage, what he says matters in terms of how people go about their daily activities, how seriously they take it. Yeah, obviously New York doesn't seem to have been a well-handled situation, but you've got other states where COVID's been a big issue.
Yeah,
and,
yeah, you've got like,
you know,
you know, like you've got Michigan, you've got New Jersey, you've got New York, and all of these were, you know, really disastrous, and they were under these Democrat governors who were putting COVID patients in nursing homes for whatever reason. But on the issue of masks, you know, to that before, again, in March, Fauci and the CDC were saying masks aren't recommended. Now, they may have been saying that because they didn't want supplies to get run down, but the official advice for months and months and months was that a mask wasn't necessary. And, you know, even today, I think even, you know, except in sort of closed quarters rather than out of the streets or in the park, there's a lot of question about their necessities. So you've got to go back to what the official advice was. Trump may have said you don't need to wear a mask in March, but that's because that's what Dr. Fauci and that's what the CDC were saying. So, you know, you got to be fair about it.
They weren't saying it was going to disappear, though, did they?
What's that?
I mean, yeah, they weren't saying things such as, oh, look, the virus will disappear.
Sure, yeah.
You know, the flirting with hydroxychloroquine as well. So, I mean, look, these are the sort of things that are going to appear in Democratic ads, aren't they?
Well, they might appear in Democrat ads, but, you know, the hydrochloroquine thing has been, you know, there's still a lot of evidence on both sides of that, depending on when you take it, whether you take it with zinc, that sort of thing. But to get bogged down in that, the thing that's going to appear in the Trump ads are going to be the lawlessness that's stricken down American cities, great American cities that have been absolutely devastated, first by riots and looters, but also by the cops being essentially held back and told not to do their jobs. And you've got crime and shootings and innocent people dying in the streets of these cities who shouldn't be dying, and they're the victims of these policies. And that's going to be, I think, Trump's big attack on Biden, because he's going to say, if you want more of this, you know, and they will come for your suburbs, because we're seeing this in places like Kenosha, Wisconsin now, then vote Democrat.
What did you make as well?
Can I just butt into, because we're really looking at this COVID issue from the prism of an Australian audience. When you're here, it's very different. People aren't taking it as seriously. You can cross state borders with absolutely nothing stopping you. People don't, we really shouldn't be looking at this like we're looking at the Australian example and thinking it's not the same there, so they must feel differently. Really here, people who are worried about it are staying home, but that's about 50%. The other 50% want to get back to work. They're frustrated, they're angry, and they're just not doing it. There's no reprimand from the government. There's no threat of fines. And so I think there is a risk, if you're looking at it from the outside, to overestimate how much it's going to impact people's votes. It's going to impact Democrats more than Republicans. They're the ones who are more likely to mail in or not vote at all. And just on that point that James Morrow made about the switching voters from Biden to Republican, the Republicans don't even need to do that. They just need the same people to turn out as last time and for the Biden supporters to be unenthusiastic. And there's a real unenthusiasm from a lot of people I'm speaking to when you have this line from the Republicans that's really working where they say Joe Biden's hiding in his basement.
Yeah.
He's about to apparently go out and start campaigning again, though. I think it's after Labor Day, Annalise, so whether that was planned before, we're not sure, but that's the key, isn't it? So your point there that he needs to
and there's a long
get
way
out
to go.
there. Yeah,
and
but if you look at 2 or 3 weeks ago, things were so overwhelming that you might just think Joe Biden could almost sit there mute for 2 or 3 months and watch Donald Trump lose the election, that now there's a bit more impetus on him to get out there.
Well, I mean, just to jump in on that, you know, one of the things that we saw today was that, and I think Annalise makes a fantastic point, that Americans have a far different attitude towards the coronavirus than Australians, who have been beaten into submission by state premiers on so much of this. But in the U.S., though, the big question now is, will Joe Biden even debate? And now you had Nancy Pelosi overnight our time in Australia saying, we don't need to have a debate because we don't want to dignify Donald Trump and blah, 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 blah. So they are now, the Democrat establishment is now actively trying to hide Joe Biden from a debate. And I think a lot of people are going to think that's pretty sus.
What about, I mean, I guess this is always a bit of an unknown question. You mentioned there how the Republicans need to get the same people out to vote, Annalise, and the Democrats need to get more people out to vote this time. That voter turnout was the issue. Is it possible, have you come across people that are genuinely in the middle politically over there and what they think of issues such as, you know, whether it be COVID, whether it be, you know, the economy and Donald Trump's plan there? Is it, I mean, how big is that segment and how much have you been able to talk to them?
Look, overwhelmingly, everyone who I've spoken to who voted Trump last time is keen to vote for him again. Those who didn't vote last time are very unenthusiastic about both. Plenty of people really didn't like Hillary Clinton and are more excited about Joe Biden, but that doesn't mean they're excited. There's still that real reservation about the fact he's really old. That's cutting through really well, just that slow Joe line. But there is that frustration among so many about the COVID virus and those who would be traditionally Democrat voters. But the thing I'm seeing that's already impacting them is that confidence in getting their vote in. They're the ones who are more likely to be worried about mailing in their vote. And that just puts that other barrier in where you're just not going to be bothered getting around to it. I spoke to one young man who voted Democrat once in his life, and when I was asking him about what life was like here, he said just everything's everything is so hard. And I asked him who he was going to vote for, and he said he couldn't be bothered. And so something's really got to change in the next 2 months to get that guy excited to think that something that they're going to do is going to change their life. You can go on about foreign policy as much as you want. What I've heard a lot of people say that they're going to vote Trump again is because of small business tax cuts, because they've hired more people because of that. And if they were taken away, they'd have to fire people. The PPP, the loans that got people through the original shutdowns, administered by the banks, they're still waiting for them to be forgiven. That's a big draw card for many people to decide which way they're going to vote. Bread and butter issues, it's the same every election, is really going to decide what people do. It all ended, by the way, with Donald Trump and his entourage looking up at the balcony as Nessun Dorma was sung by a tenor. So it certainly didn't lack in pageantry. What about, James, you know, all the various claims that Trump always makes? Now, essentially, a lot of them have an element of truth, are based on some sort of truth, and then if people delve into it, they usually find, I'm sure you're going to dispute on elements of this, that there are elements that are untruthful. Donald Trump's been the best president since Abraham Lincoln for African Americans. The Democrats want to remove
one country under God from the oath. I think it was found that 2 small council meetings or something omitted that. So maybe
they did that at They did that at the Democratic National Convention, and just also in terms of.
But it wasn't the main element, was it? It was a couple of rooms or councils they're described as, I think. So
these are the that's a sort of cultural issue, though, that you're going to wind up seeing more and more of. I mean, the same people who have been supporting the tearing down of statues, you think they want to keep under God and the Pledge of Allegiance, you think they want to even keep the Pledge of Allegiance, but that's another story. On the African-American question, it's a very defensible case. You know, one of the most moving things we saw before Donald Trump speak was that woman who was the Prison Reform Act advocate. She spent 22 years in jail, and she was released from prison as part of these prison reforms. And she and Donald Trump has been a huge leader where the Democrats haven't been in reducing sentences and getting people out of prison who were there for far too long unfairly, and they were predominantly African Americans. You know, that has been a huge godsend for a lot of people. But also in terms of before the pandemic, things like unemployment, job growth, the catching up between the black community and the white community in terms of their economics and their wealth and income, that has done spectacularly well under Donald Trump, and it never did well under the Democrats. The Democrats, I think, had an attitude which we started to see a lot of black conservatives. We saw a lot more, I think, black people at this convention of the Republicans than we did for the Democrats, coming out and saying, you know, actually, this has been really, really good for us, and this administration has been good for us, and the Democrats have taken us for granted for far too long.
But isn't that sort of flourish where you go...
And James, I've heard so many African-American people say, just on Kamala Harris...
Yeah,
go ahead, Annalise.
Just on Kamala Harris, I've heard so many African-American people say that they're really worried about her history as a prosecutor, that she put black people away, and that's going to alienate so many of those voters. When you look at Milwaukee and the African-American turnout there, and that was so decisive in the election, and then they pick someone who puts a lot of black people away, that is going to have an undeniable impact on how many people decide to get enthusiastic enough out to vote.
Yeah, well, that's a fascinating play of this, isn't it? It's a choice of running mate that is supposed to provide both elements of law and order and perhaps helping the African-American vote. Maybe sometimes it gets you both, maybe it gets you neither. What about made in China, James Morrow? Unravel that one for us.
Are we talking about the virus or trade in general? I mean, I think, you know, in general.
Well, he's saying not the virus. I'm not sure it was made there. It certainly seemed to originate from there. But no, it'll be made in America for under me, or made in China under Joe Biden.
This is something, so, you know, like, this is a pitch that's made explicitly to the working class, because so many manufacturing jobs have been sent overseas, and they turned much of America into a service economy, as they did here in Australia, too. And so those sorts of working class jobs went to China, and we all know the story of that. But the really interesting thing about that, to me, is that, you know, it's not just the working class people who were affected by this, but also very senior business people I've spoken to in the United States have told me, I can't come out and say this, but I am so glad, we are so glad, you know, as business leaders, that Trump has taken on this issue. And I've been hearing this for years and years and years. And, you know, so there's real mileage, I think, in pushing that button, because, you know, we all know, we don't have to go through the whole laundry list of different ways in which China violates, you know, intellectual property, trade agreements, currency, the South China Sea, human rights, Tibet, the Uyghurs, blah. You know, we could do hours on that, and we would need to. But, you know, to push that button, I think it's not only effective, I think it's quite correct politically to do, because ultimately, you know, the president is the president for the American people. He's not there to provide jobs to people in other countries. He's there to make sure that the people in his country are doing well. And that, I think, people said, well, the political class before this, they said, no, we're all globalists now. We're not really Americans. And now you see, you know, the same people who, you know, Trump was pointing that at, they're all now on Twitter right now freaking about the number of flags he had on stage, because apparently, you know, that's now offended them too.
Yeah, well, I mentioned it. I didn't say I was offended, but...
Oh, no, you weren't offended. You were just counting it. You were just making the point. But some of these people on Twitter, you know, they're furious about it.
Well, I still remember the flag counting days in Australian politics. It was a heady time. James Morrow, Annalise Nielsen, we have to leave it there. We could talk longer, but thank you. Talk again soon.